Thanks everyone for joining another episode of Cyber Talk with Nikolai. So today's conversation is going to be about cybersecurity risk. I think that's something we need to take a little bit deeper look, and we have a special guest today with us who has tremendous experience in this area, and he is ready and willing to share all the excitement that he's learned about risk management and how to properly apply. And I think the importance of having proper conversation about the risk and how to characterize goes back to how you want to present and to your management and how you want to obtain additional tools. Because from cybersecurity perspective or from cybersecurity practitioners, we often go and buy tools because it's pretty cool and we know what tool does. But at the end of the day, when we try to present this tool to somebody above us, they not necessarily know what this tool does and how it works, but they understand more conversation about the risk. It's like, what does it address? Why do I need this tool? I understand that you're in cybersecurity and you know what it is and you know how it's going to work, but I'm in business and I'm managing the company, so I don't really operate on the same terminology and the same ideas. So I think it's important to address this conversation. So with that said, I'm going to turn right now over to Malcolm Harkins. He's going to do his own introduction, and I'm pretty sure most of you already know him. And he will give us a little bit idea about his background, and then we're going to go and take a deep dive into conversation about the risk. So, Malcolm, on to you.
Hey, thanks, Nikolai. Happy to have this conversation with you. I'm Chief Security and Trust Officer with an early stage cybersecurity startup called Epiphany Systems. Been with the company since it launched, going into Black Hat last year. Prior to that, spent a bit of time in a web application security company, again, early stage startup. Prior to that, at Cylance, where I was Chief Security and Trust Officer, and joined back in 2015 and was with Cylance for a little over 4 years. And then prior to that, my life was simple. I was at Intel straight out of graduate school and eventually became Chief Security and Privacy Officer worldwide. So I oversaw all the typical information security type functions, the information risk and compliance type functions. I oversaw product security, so the security development lifecycle and privacy by design for Intel's products and services. And I ran corporate emergency management and a few other duties and activities along the way.
Actually, that's when we met. I was attending CISO class at UC Berkeley, and I think you were doing risk conversation in one of those meetings that we had at that time. So I still remember that, and it was pretty cool. And then I think our relationship started, and we've been probably for the past 10 years talking to each other and continue to cheer each other on doing so. So it's great. Thank you for your intro. So let's just get into the conversation. So, how do you define cybersecurity risk? Again, when I was talking about this at the beginnings, like people don't really have this clear definition. And when they go in to procure all the tools and present it to management, they usually come in with a tool shed of different toys. It's like, hey, here's something I want to play with, but the conversation about the risk is hugely missed. And sometimes it's a detrimental factor where people can get approval how to get their tools and what they're trying to manage. So, how do you define cybersecurity risk?
Well, so I'm a former finance guy, right, and former procurement person and business operations person long before I tripped my way into security 20 years ago. So I started with the broad view, any in essence definitional perspective on risk, which is the potential for harm or danger, right? Much like it would be if you had financial risk or earthquake risk, anything of any physical or other nature. It's again that potential for harm. And then the question just becomes harm to who? Is it harm to the business? Is it harm to your customers? Or is it societal harm? Now, then when you start looking at it from that perspective, you have to start thinking, okay, now what's cyber security risk then? For me, I've always had a broad definition of it and more broadly kind of an information and technology risk. So it's the data and the implications of that data having risk issues again on the business, on the customer, on society, the system itself or the application. So it's both the technology itself as well as the data. And again, the same things that we all talk about, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So when you start looking at it, it's a multi-dimensional thing around who might be harmed, what aspects of information and technology create risks that could cause harm. And so for me, when I think of that broad notion of cybersecurity risk, it encompasses all those things, including the compliance and legal liability side of things. So I have a wide definition of it just because of my background. And it's in some cases a lot larger in scope than what I'd say the traditional view of infosec risk being the enterprise IT risk. Your email, your laptops, that data, maybe some things on the cloud. But it's a lot of people have defined it whatever the scope of the CIO is, and I don't define it that way. I never have.
It also probably helps since you came from the background of in finance, so you didn't step into cybersecurity and you start working with those controls. And in your view, you had a lot broader perspective on how business functions. What do they care about? How do they address certain things? And how do they go about spending their money? So coming to cybersecurity seems like helped you to shape your ideas. Okay, here's what I'm going to do with cybersecurity, and here's what I know how business functions and how do I connect all those dots together. Do you think that kind of successful paths for organizations are when they approach, let's say, chief information security officers? A lot of them, they have just computer background. So then they come in with this big tool set to say, here's what is going to cybersecurity program look like, and I need $10 million. And probably CFO is going to start smiling. It's like, yeah, sure. Tell me more a little bit. So do you think this is
Yeah,
a path where somebody can learn something?
Yeah, I'll give you a quote that I said, over 30 years ago when I joined Intel as a young finance procurement person. A fool with the tool is still a fool. A tool that does not deliver an outcome because either the tool's incapable of it or the people managing it or utilizing it are incapable of it, it's a fool's errand. So for me, everything's got to be outcome driven. A business, whether it be a for-profit business, a public business, a private business, everybody's responsible for an outcome. And the hard part that I think we suffer in the information security side of things is we don't necessarily fully understand the mission of the business, how to your point, a business makes money, where it makes money, how it has customer affinity, brand loyalty, what margins are, how to get yield out of a factory, all those things that I grew up with my background learning and seeing at Intel. And so for me, when I got into security in late 2001, it was after 9/11 and after Code Red and NIMDA that occurred in the summer fall of 9/11. And Intel's chief information officer at the time, when they came and asked me to run security, he sought me out because I had spent enough time in IT finance and strategic procurement supporting IT capabilities. And the discussion was, I don't know anything about information security. And he's like, that's fine. I get a bunch of security geeks who don't know anything about the business. They'll teach you and you'll teach them. He wanted me in the role because of my business acumen. And I've long said there's two battlefields a CISO faces. There's the external battlefield of the threat actors and threat agents and all the vulnerability stuff we see day in and day out in the news. But there's an internal battlefield of budgets, bureaucracies, and behaviors. And he wanted me in that role because I knew how to play on that internal battlefield to drive influence, to drive impact, to get the right resources aligned, to deliver business outcomes that wouldn't impede the business objectives for design and product and shipment. Though at times, if I needed to interrupt that because the risk was so imminent, he also knew that I would do that. But I would have a optimized perspective on how to enable the business as well as protect it. Hence my tagline, protect to enable, that matured over time a few years into the role as I really put my arms around more aspects of security and other risk and compliance functions.
Got it. No, it's certainly fascinating. So, Malcolm, when you look and you just mentioned interesting thing, protect to enable, how would you see people converging this conversation about the risk and what business can drive or what they can drive business at to be a little bit more successful and gain or glean into understanding what business does, and then business would stop seeing them not inhibitors of anything good that is going to ever come out from cybersecurity. So, how would you say they can go about converting this conversation to say yes? Every time security comes into the room, they said they being welcome. It's like, yeah, somebody's coming to help us, not tell that everything needs to stop right now.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. I've seen certainly since I started talking about business enablement 17, 18 years ago, in the industry and with peers and stuff like that, in a lot of people talked about it as the office of no. And let's just say, even in my early year or two into security, I was pretty draconian on things. We gave people 30 seconds to save data on their systems, and I was forcing a patch because we had such hygiene issues 20 plus years ago. It was very draconian. So I've done that stuff, and I would do it again under the right circumstances and in risk conditions. Uh, but I think, some in the information security organizations have transitioned, and they do talk about the business enablement. Unfortunately, some of them look at it and go, well, the business accepted the risk, and so therefore it's all okay. Or they've become the office of yes, and they don't know how to say no anymore. So for me, it's this interesting perspective of how do you enable the business, but if the potential for harm is great enough, and either society's impacted, the customer's impacted, your shareholders are impacted significantly enough, there's a time and a place to say, hell no, that's not happening on my watch, and walk up the chain of command to somebody who's an appropriate risk approver. And I think a lot of people get that confused. I saw that with a number of CIOs that I work for, and they were like, Malcolm, you work for me. And I said, no, I report to you. I work for a company called Intel Corporation. I don't confuse the two, and neither should you. And in many cases, the risk decision was above the pay grade of the CIO, it was above the pay grade of a CTO, business unit general manager. And so that's where you have to look at it and you go, much like, again, I'm a former finance and procurement person, right? There was purchasing authorities, right? Malcolm had $1 million signature authority, but he still couldn't buy anything unless finance approved the purchase order. And procurement actually went and negotiated the deal, right? In a particular price. So it's a similar thing in my mind. And I think people need to establish what I'll say risk authority levels, and not what I'm saying high, medium, and low type stuff. I'm talking real dollar material impact. If it's going to harm society, I don't think a business unit general manager, if the harm is substantial enough, is okay to approve it, right? And we can look at physical examples of that type of stuff, right? When physical goods get shipped, the CEO, the board sometimes is personally accountable for those risk decisions, and we've got to start thinking the same way on the cyber risk. But getting back to your point of how do you do this, you really have to spend time understanding the businesses we talked about. Go have quarterly one-on-ones with the business unit general managers. Go meet with the CFO, figuring out where there is pricing or margin issues. There's a notion that I've had for a long time that I codified in my 9 box of controls, and it's a third dimension to kind of risk and cost, and it's control friction, because controls are an impediment. They slow down people, data, and business processes. They chew up unnecessary compute cycles. And too frequently, we're just throwing in controls because the policy said to, or compliance said to, or that's the only thing we know how to do. And so we put these impediments in place, and those can impact a business's velocity, its time to market, its cost structure, its brand loyalty. And so, in some cases, if you approached it and said, well, how could I design the control or implement the control in a way that actually improved business velocity, while managing risk and while lowering cost, you're going to be better aligned with the business because you're going to be delivering an outcome that the business wants, which is the lowest risk possible at the lowest cost possible with the least amount of friction possible.
Heading into one about your 9 block, but before 9 block, we had conversation that you just talked about. One thing that bothers me all the time, and I know a lot of people in the same boat, risk acceptance and reports in line. That usually kind of goes hand in hand when somebody comes in. It's like, yeah, accept this risk. And then CISO stand there. It's like, I don't feel like we should be accepting risk. And I've heard people also having conversations about kind of fifths sort of way to accept risk, kind of acknowledge but do not accept, sort of speak. Yeah, I know it exists, but I don't want to do anything about it. So, how do
Well,
you feel about it, or how would you say somebody has to approach and say, "Look, I don't really like what you're saying. Accept the risk. I can go your way," or there is a line in the sand where you can clearly say, look, it's not up to you anymore to accept this risk. I know you can accept it, but as a company, we shouldn't.
yeah, there's definitely integrity issues that come into play. And in fact, the panel that I'm leading at the RSA conference coming up in June is on integrity matters. And I have some CISOs, and we talk about sometimes those pressures and where people are encouraged, if not forced, to sometimes water down the portrait of risk to the board or an executive. And so you have to be careful of that. Take the coaching on how to manage the message. Don't take coaching on how to massage the message. Again, those are two different things. But you get into risk acceptance, and one of the things that drives me nuts is people don't realize that risk acceptance is a business process. It is not a control, right? It doesn't control for risk. You're just acknowledging that you're not going to take steps to prevent it or perhaps detect it early enough. But when you accept risk, you're also accepting the responsibility to respond to it should it manifest itself. And that's also a strong point of confusion for folks. You can't just ignore it because you accepted it. You are now accountable to respond to it if and when it should ever become unmitigated, right? Or manifest itself within your enterprise or in a way that affects your enterprise. And that's again something that a lot of people miss. They think of accepting risk, they're done with it. And in reality, you're not.
Where they disposition risk the way they felt or the way they had controls laid out at the time, and then revisit them on a regular basis and reconcile again. Do we still continue to accept this risk, or shall we change to something else? And maybe right now we have better control somewhere existed, and here the CISO comes in with a new and exciting toy, and that toy essentially helps to mitigate the risk instead of just accepting it. Is it sort of the suggestion that we should tell the audience that they need to have?
I'm not a big fan as much as I use them of risk registers because I think they're so in the minutia, right? Where the risk register is full of the gazillion vulnerabilities that exist, right? And it's this constant thing if you're really doing it. And so again, you're chewing up a lot of cycles. And while that's necessary, it's also not what what the business or the executives need. They need a picture of the enterprise cyber risk landscape, and they need to know where the enterprise is exploitable to a material exposure or a significant event. Those are the material things, right? That really matter to the business. So the question becomes, how are you having a discussion around material exposure? How are you having a discussion around the exploitability? Not, I'm just saying the exploit of a vulnerability to create a foothold. Just because you get a foothold because a system get popped doesn't mean you have a material event, right? So you really need to understand the attack depth potential within your environment and really how you're managing that. And I think if people did that and talked about the material exposures, the exploitability, of the business to material risk, it would be easier to have a risk dialogue and also get funded or make a decision that we can't mitigate it to prevent it, but we have to put in detection and response capabilities to again prevent the harm from becoming materially damaging to the organization, the customer, perhaps society, again, depending upon the context of the risks.
Okay, Malcolm, I think you described pretty well what organizations need to focus on, and something that we touched upon before, and you mentioned in one of your responses, it's 9 block risk sort of control, and that 9 block I still remember, and I actually have it on my screen right now. So you designed it back in 2016, and it was kind of interesting. You put a lot of things together into one little slide to show organizations where controls lie. And I think this 9 block can also support a lot of conversations when you bring it up as executive management if explained properly. And this is so. Could you please give us a little bit ideas how this 9 block came about and what organization can use to address the risk and help to have conversations or meaningful conversations?
Yeah, I'd say that the drawing got codified then, but the essence of it started back when I landed in security, back a little over 20 years ago. Because again, business outcomes. What did when I landed in security, Andy Grove was still running Intel. So I looked at it and said, okay, as a former finance person, I need to deliver outcomes. What are those outcomes? Risk was an outcome, lower risk. Cash is king. If I'm spending money on information security, it doesn't add to Intel's bottom line. It might be an insurance policy to some extent to mitigate losses, but it's not. It's not a revenue contributor. So I'm adding expense. So total cost of controls I wanted to manage, and then this again notion of friction, and then I codified it in the 9 box. So on the vertical axis, you've got risk as you go from prevention to detection to response, risk grows. And then there's three primary ways in which you can approach controls. So on the horizontal axis, you've got automated, semi-automated, and manual. And as you go from automation to manual, cost grows. And the third dimension, so it's actually a 27 box if I could actually draw it. Third dimension is control friction, that drag coefficient. And so for me, I've looked at it, excuse me. And for me, I've looked at it and said, where am I at strategically? If I looked at the state of the organization, the state of risk, the state of spending, where are we? So when I drew this picture, I was meaning to draw it in a way that we could position a particular control. Is it preventive? Is it detective? Is it responsive? Is it automated, semi-automated, manual? And how much friction does it have? So you could actually, when you're looking at a tool or business process control, figure out where it is. And if it's a more responsive capability, because its effectiveness in preventing things is low, so the result is you're responding a lot and you're doing it manually, you're high cost, high risk. And if it impedes the users, it's high friction. Well, then the question becomes, how do I evaluate the next tool? And if it gives me lower risk, lower total cost of controls, and lower friction, you're better off. Now, the other way to look at this is holistically. What's the total cost that you're spending on information security? Not just the security budget, the impact on computing, the impact on IT, the impact on end users, the impact on incidents and the reactions that occur. That's the total cost. You might have a $50 million information security budget, but you might have a $200 million total cost of controls annually. And you might have that because the efficacy of your controls is low. So even though you have preventative controls, you end up in a lot of detection and response activities. So in that case, organizationally, you're in a high risk, high cost, in essence, state. And again, when you look at the friction components, there's ways to assess from the business how much security is impeding the output of an organization. Now, if you're in that state, and I've done this when I've looked at organizations, I would come in and say, how do I retool and have a strategy that says, I got to constantly shift left to automation to lower cost. I got to constantly push down to prevention to lower risk. And I've got to strip away that friction. Now, that's for me a cohesive information security strategy. So I can look at this 9 box as a way to assess a tool by tool comparison. But I can also look at it and say, organizationally, how do we deliver a better strategic result that the business would want? Lower risk, lower cost, and lower friction.
In some cases, it's opened a lot of conversations, and other cases, people pretty much understood what it meant. And you cleverly put things together, and especially like you described it, when you look at controls and where you spend the money, what is going to give you the best bang for your buck or the biggest yield once you spend it in financial space. Have you seen or have you got a lot of feedback from anyone besides myself in talking about it? And have you been able to apply this idea and 9 blog that you designed and with other organizations?
I've had a lot of folks comment on it, both online as well as actually use it internally in their information security strategy settings, where again they're evaluating a tool. Well, 3 output criteria: what does it do to risk? What does it do to cost? And what does it do to friction on the business? So at the aggregate, that's how you should be making the decision as to whether or not the tool is worth buying or not. Again, my fool is a tool is still a fool. A lot of times we get enamored with technology without realizing the output and outcome that we should get by the purchase. And I've had other folks who've used it and use it in their annual board reviews where they talk about structurally where the information security efforts are at, and then strategically what they're planning to invest in, or in some cases where they need money to invest to deliver a different business outcome. And imagine going to the CEO or the CFO or the CIO and say, hey, we're spending 50 million on my infosec budget, where our total cost is 200 million, and we still have a high degree of risk because we're so reactionary, and we've evaluated the sales effort and the design effort and manufacturing, and we think we're impeding productivity by 20 to 25% in 3 organizations. And so that's the state of the state. And what I'd like to do is request an additional 7 million in spending for my information security budget. I'm going to shrink over the next 2 years the total cost of controls from 200 million to 150 million. I'm going to make a 10% improvement in productivity in these 3 organizations. Well, that's something somebody could wrap their head around. Spend 10 additional million to save 50 million and get a 10% productivity boost in a few other organizations that have nothing to do with information security. Where do I sign up? I think there's an evergreen aspect to it, because I think even physically, if we were to think about risk or even financial risks, right? There's 3 primary ways you can control for risk: prevent it, detect it, or respond to it. And there's 3 different ways you can manage risk: automated, semi-automated, manual. Think of firefighting, right? A a manual control would be going and grabbing buckets of water and responding, right? An automated control would be sprinklers in the ceiling, smoke detector. So again, we've got these things physically that minimize harm, right? Control friction. It's a little bit different in some of the physical spaces, but think of the TSA going through the airport. There's a lot of friction going through to get screened, right? So again, in the same way, you can look at it and say, okay, there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of delays. What's the cost of that to me? What's the cost to have all that security? And what real risks are mitigated out of it, right? So you can take the same philosophy.
Okay. So Malcolm, we talked a lot about risk today, and one thing that I still have on my mind, and I've seen a lot of organizations are still struggling with risk characterizations and how to bring this conversation towards executive management. Have you seen the same? Why do you think the reason that there are a lot of still strugglers out there, and how can we help them? So how?
Yeah, so everything has to come back into an understanding of, like we talked about before, what is the harm to the business, what's the harm to the business's customers, and what's potentially societal harm. If you boil it up to those material risk incidents, how can an information security related risk create a multi-billion-dollar impact? Like one of the things that I did at Intel, I did at Silence, I do any of the companies that I've worked for. I look at it and I go, what are the enterprise risks that the organization faces? And then how does an information security related risk directly or indirectly contribute to that material risk? And if it's the number one risk is a smoking hole for a factory because it's a sole source factory and it's the highest margin, most revenue producing product. Well, then you got to go, what's the likelihood that a cyber incident could create a logical equivalent of losing the factory? Ransomware. Okay, well, what are the ways in which that could occur? And what are the mitigations that we have in place, and what holes do we have, right? And so I think if we think about the organization's material exposure, material risk issues, then you can again tie information security to them. If you can't, then either the connection to those material risk issues doesn't exist, or you haven't figured out how they are connected, in which case you got to do more homework.
And I think it's kind of like if you start walking through in steps of somebody else, who you're trying to protect, what they do, and connecting all those conversations together, it will help to understand them better and yourself better, what they're actually doing and how what you're applying is going to work for them.
Yeah, so giving a concrete example, if I was an information security officer for a fast food restaurant chain, you go, okay, what's the material events that could affect a fast food chain restaurant? And I'll be directionally correct. Food safety, so E. coli, bacteria, something that causes people to be sick. Credit cards are offline, so you can't book revenue, right? The registers are gone. There might be a few other things, the affinity program that has privacy implications and compliance stuff. So three primary risks. You go, and if I'm just talking about payment card industry standard compliance to be able to process credit cards, that might be a yawn for the board and a risk that they're willing to accept. But people potentially getting sick or dying because of food safety, probably not. Well, so the question becomes, could a cybersecurity incident cause an integrity issue with the food safety data? And the answer is yes, because the flow of the data from the slaughterhouse all the way through the point of sale, it could be compromised intentionally or by mistake and cause a food safety issue. And so if I was in a food and beverage organization, that's probably the material risk I'd spend most of my time on in terms of really what's my cybersecurity program for my food safety data.
Got it. All right, so I think we're getting close to the end of it. And any kind of parent thoughts are, do you have any cool, funny, anecdotal evidence of anything that you would like to share? Because you've been in the business for way too long and kind of like your catching phrase, fool with a tool is still a fool. It's kind of sticks, but do you have some kind of like something that you can share to leave audience with? It's like, hey, those are pretty cool things can happen to you, and you should remember those.
Yeah, losers quit when they're tired, winners quit when they've won. And the hard part is this is a journey with no finish line. And we shouldn't just give in, we shouldn't just give up. And the other thing, don't always trust what the security industry tells you. Security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. So some of the security vendors out there have a macroeconomic incentive to perpetuate the risk paradigm that we've seen for the past couple decades. So, while we need the tools, while we need the solutions, really think hard about how they make their money. And are they making money the more risk that occurs for you? Are they making money because they've delivered outcomes that lower risk, lower cost, and lower friction on the business?
All right. Thank you for that, Malcolm, and certainly appreciate you coming on. And even so, we had a few hiccups with videos and a little bit with audio. I think it turned out pretty good at the end. So thank you again, and I'm pretty sure we'll be talking and looking forward to having you again on my show on Cyber Talk with Nikolai. So thank you, and
Anytime.
thank you, audience, for participating. And again, we're here today just because we are stronger together. So, as Malcolm pointed out, we need to work collectively. And this is one of the things we're trying to help each other to educate and spread the knowledge and build things together. So, collectively, we can defend ourselves a lot better than individually. So, stay tuned for next show coming up. And once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Malcolm. And I'm gonna wrap it up here. We're stronger together. Until next time.